Thank you all for being out here today. And I hope when you think back on this talk today, you'll associate it with March 1st being tomorrow. So I sort of brought in the new month, which leads to spring. And, and the masters, of course, will confirm that it's the spring. But this is the talk that sort of starts the matriculation. Today we're going to be talking about the monuments on the battlefield, but with a creative twist to it all. And I've got some really good slides for you. I think you'll have fun. It's very creative, the talk is. It has a few mind benders in it. So at the end, there'll be some bewildered looks in the audience, but hopefully not. We're going to have a really good time, and I feel really upbeat, and we're just going to have a good time. And as we go through this topic, notice that my subtitle is entitled, Removing the Blinders. And when you think of blinders, you tend to think of a horse having blinders, and there are variations on blinders, but blinders keep a horse from being able to see peripherally in a battle or crossing a bridge so that they don't panic. Blinders can be intentional, non-intentional. Blinders in the field of history block us from seeing the obvious. And I try to work all the time to ask myself, where are the blind spots? What am I missing? And when you're doing history, when you're practicing history, the job of a new history student, for instance, in college, is they're given the task that out in the future, they should look for gaps in the storyline, gaps in the field, and then it becomes their mission to fill that gap. And blinders, once those blinders are taken off, you can see the gaps and then it's easier to fill them. But you have to think outside of a paradigm. You have to think non-traditionally. And some of you know I like to do that. So blind spots then. Blind spots and blinders from a historian's standpoint then has to do with something that's there, that's obvious, right under your nose. It's there all along. But you were stuck in a paradigm and not able to see it. And so what I'm going to try to do today, without being pretentious, is try to take some blinders off, okay, so that you see the monuments very different. Okay, and we've got several to go through and some creative analysis, and we'll have some fun along the way. But let's just jump right into it. And you'll have to decide which one was the best and which one was the worst. I'm enjoying doing each one of them, but this one is a doozy to begin with, and it is the High Watermark Monument. All of you have seen the High Watermark Monument, right? Okay. And if we were to take off the blinders and we were to really see it, and to see it with all of its layers of meaning, indeed those layers are there and they're deep. The High Watermark Monument is an open book. And when you look at an open book on a battlefield or in a cemetery or wherever an open book is presented amongst other statues and other monuments, an open book always means one thing. It means authoritative word. Authoritative word. An open book always means, in monumentation, authoritative word. Now, if that book is on a podium, a lectern, or an altar, then it is, there is a divine meaning behind that authoritative word. A podium, a lectern, or an altar that holds up a book means there's a divine meaning. And in the United States, there tends to be, particularly in the 19th century, an evangelical twist to the whole thing, if it's a divine meaning. And you'll notice that I put in the lower right-hand corner an altar, an ancient altar. You know, ancient people sacrificed on altars. Altars have to do with sacrifice. They have to do with slitting the throat of a lamb or a bull or killing an animal in exchange for sins, transgressions of a people. So an altar has to do with blood sacrifice. And so this is a serious message. The book is sitting on a lectern at the least, and on a blood sacrifice altar at most. Now, as we look closer, we need to know what this this is saying to us because it's a divine authoritative word that we need to hear. So as we look closer at it, we'll notice in the upper right-hand corner a overturned ear of the page. And when you're reading and you turn the ear and pinch the ear of the page that you're reading in a book, what does that imply usually?
Bookmark.
Bookmark. You don't have a bookmark with you, and so you want to make sure someone needs your attention right then. You want to be able to return to that page without any lost time. So you bend the ear. If we want to give a solid word to that for memorial, it would be memory. A turned ear on a page, on a monument book, a memorial book, always means memory. So you never want to forget this page. This is getting more interesting. This is a divine authoritative word, potentially on an altar of sacrifice. And a page is marked that we should never forget. We should always remember. Okay, as the drama builds then, we look closely at it. And it's a book that has multiple pages to it, but it's open to July 3rd, 1863, to Pickett's Charge, Battle of Gettysburg. And so if we look back, page 1 would be Big Bethel, First Manassas, some of the earlier battles of the war in 1861, 1862. We have Antietam and Shiloh and so forth. We have Fredericksburg. Towards the end of the war, we have the whole 1864 campaign, Spotsylvania Wilderness. At the end, we have Appomattox. But the book is permanently marked to never be forgotten to 1863, to July 3rd, and to Pickett's Charge. So as we look even closer, the deeds are spelled out for that day. And on the left side are all the deeds of Confederate battalions and divisions that made the attack known as Pickett's Charge, or at the time, Longstreet's Assault. And on the far right page are all the deeds in defense of Cemetery Hill carried out by the Union Army. Now, if this is a divine authoritative message, and if we put an American evangelical twist to this, the book of Revelation says in the final judgment, the populations, the entire world will be divided into two segments. Those on the left and those on the right. Those on the left will be cast into outer darkness where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. This is a serious message, you see. And on the right will be those that enter thy good and faithful servant. The divine authoritative word that we find in this book that's upon an altar, that's ear pinned to a page that we should never forget, is not a reconciliation message. It's a message that the Confederates are permanently on the wrong side of history. Okay, and right, when you dig deeper and you look at the deeper meanings, that's what it's telling us here. I'll add one more aspect to it as we try to dig deeper, and that is the term high watermark of the rebellion. That's a disrespect in the greatest sense, because did you know the official government title for the war is not the American Civil War, or is during the Spanish-American War in 1898, they like to call it the War of the Late Unpleasantness. And then there are a host of other titles, but the official title of the war and official government paperwork is the War of the Rebellion, which denies that the Southern Confederacy ever existed. I did a talk at Fredericksburg when I worked there in the late 80s, and I did a presentation in the auditorium, and I talked about Confederate nationalism, and I struck a chord, a vibe that ran deeply in the room that I didn't realize was there. There were people that immediately rejected the notion of Confederate nationalism, because to recognize that the Confederates were a nation is to call into question the official name of the war. So John Batchelder, who designed this monument and dedicated it in the early 1890s, is telling us that there was a divine judgment here, and the rebellion essentially ended here, or the beginning of its end was here. Now, there's another way to look at the same set of monuments. We could look at it, and I've already hinted and alluded towards this, that it's an altar of liberty. That the arrangement where there's the lectern or the altar and then the open book the two cannons, the triangular cannonballs that used to be there, and the eclectic mix of monuments in the background, along with the copse of trees surrounded by an iron fence to memorialize the trees as a symbolic aiming point of Pickett's charge. All of that whole arrangement put together by John Batchelder, the first official historian of the battlefield, and an artist and a cartographer. Batchelder is designing, with the placement of all of the above, an altar of liberty in the true sense that the French would have presented it in their artwork in the 1790s with the French Revolution. So as we look to the far left of the screen, we see Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's often referred to as the father of the French Revolution and the father of Western, essentially the father of Western civilization, because his book, The Social Contract, became the text for the French Revolution. It summarized the whole notion of all men are created equal, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, all the things that we hold near and dear to our hearts. He summarized in a book called The Social Contract, which sent the 19th century into revolution, essentially, over ideas of social justice and all men are created equal. So there he is, deified at the top of your screen, top left. And then there is an interesting medley of artifacts all around at the base of it. And so let's take a look at some of these. You have, in the center, you have a tree of liberty. And on that tree, next to that tree of liberty, you have a fisk of pikes. Within the fisk of pikes, you have a liberty pole with a toboggan cap on top of it, a fez cap of sorts, that would be considered a liberty cap. You have the loyal dog, if I can find him in there, but the loyal dog is here on this. By the way, this is an altar to liberty. And then you have maidens over to your right. They represent purity, they represent virtue, they represent the ideals, the virtues that democracies aspire to. You have a sans culotte in the lower part of the screen here, and he represents the lower class that the French Revolution elevated into a middle class. You have a soldier standing on guard and an artillery piece. Can you all see those things back there? And when Matt Hughes sends this out on YouTube, he will have access to these slides directly, so they'll show up clarity out there in internet land. But hopefully you can see them now. Now, when you have a fisk of pikes represents a stockade that has instruments there, that has weapons there, so there can be an instant defense of any challenge to liberty. The liberty pole, which appears on a lot of monuments on this battlefield, usually it's in the hands of Lady Liberty, but this liberty pole would be a pole that would be driven in the ground to represent a rally place where people would come and talk about their grievances from whoever was oppressing them. Like someone might gather around a street lamp today, or at the corner of the mall, or the Target, or the Walmart. And there's a meeting place, a breakfast place that they meet, and they talk about what's going on in their lives. And in Massachusetts, for instance, in Boston, there was a liberty tree. And in the French Revolution, American Revolution, there were liberty trees. But if you didn't have a tree, there was a makeshift tree by just sticking a pole in the ground, and that's where you could have your round discussion of liberty. Slaves in antiquity had to have their heads shaved. So not only like the Jews during World War II and the Holocaust, they wore the Star of David, so they stood out. They couldn't intermingle in public without being easily spotted. Slaves in antiquity in ancient Rome, people like Spartacus and others, had to have their hair shaved so when they were out in public, they were recognized as slaves. Well, if they were manumitted or freed, they wore this cap, this liberty cap, that allowed their hair to grow in while they could still intermingle with everyone in disguise. And so the artists during the French Revolution and revolutions all throughout the 1800s used that cap atop the pole to mean all of the above. There's a laurel wreath there too that has to do with victory. Don't rest on your laurels. You've heard that before. And so the pikes are a surrounding defense of the Liberty pole, the Liberty cap, and then there's a Liberty tree to reinforce all of the above. There's a bright light in the background. This is common to an artwork related to French Revolution. Whole questions, I'll take them at the end. I have a lot to do and I've got to keep moving. And the bright light that you, yes, did you want to comment on the bright light?
If we could dim the lights, we could all see better.
Yes, would you someone dim the lights over there? Thank you. Is that better? Thank you, sir. Thanks for continuing to press me on that. I needed to hear that. Okay. And the bright light that we see in the upper right-hand corner then has to do with the light of social justice being shined on people for the first time because the letter of the law, that is, the code of law, is being enforced rather than a tyrant's mood swings. And so that's the altar of liberty. And if you go across the battlefield here at Gettysburg, you see similar arrangements, but maybe none more distinct than at high watermark. You have the artillery pieces. You ever wonder why there's two artillery pieces sitting there? Batchelder is trying to talk about the defense of liberty. The copse of trees in his mind are likely the tree of liberty. The iron fence is likely the Fisk of Pikes. And the monuments that you see in the background are the monuments that you would see in the background related to a throwback to antiquity and to everything that had to do with the classics and everything to do with original democracy in ancient times. Okay, and so we see, I told you this was going to be deep. Okay, all right, there's a lot to go. Later on I'll remember I didn't say this or that, but let's keep it moving then. I tell my students that redundancy is a good thing. So there's a few of you who've heard me talk about the Soldiers' National Monument. I'm going to switch it up a little bit and talk about the figures at the base of the monument. I'll keep it moving. I won't go in depth as much as for those who have been out there with me on the field. But the Soldiers' National Monument sits roughly where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, in the center of the Civil War section of graves of the National Cemetery. It was dedicated in 1869, about 6 years after Lincoln's speech. And we see Lady Liberty there at the top. But we've talked a lot about her in the past if you've been on my talks and programs. Let's talk more about the people at the base of the monument. At the base of the monument, we have four figures. We have war and history, and then there are two more figures you'll be introduced to shortly. On the far left, we have war. Now, war in a classic, traditional classic sense, and in a pure, let's say, romantic monument. Romantic is that and neoclassicism are the words that would be used to describe this kind of sculpture. But as we look at Randolph Rogers' sculpture here of war, Rogers played around with the ideal of what a Roman war figure would look like. He would normally have a brush on top of a helmet, and he would have a cape. If we were to see him in full color, it would be a red cape, and he would be the god of war, Mars, in the Roman tradition. Neoclassicism, which was a form of art that prevailed from about the 1750s all the way up until 1900, and there's still elements of it out there today. Neoclassicism played around with the traditional ancient figures and would put modern twist on them. And so what we have here is a modern soldier representing the ancient god of war. And notice that he's lending his left hand in the direction of history, and she's listening. And her name, if we were to go with the traditional word, it would be Cleo. Have you ever heard of a Cleometrician? That's a form of history that involves mathematics, quantitative history, and the sorts. graphs and charts that you would see that have to do with mathematical equations in a history book is called Cleometrician work. It's named after the goddess of history, Cleo. She's also a muse. Muse comes from the Greek word ruminate. Muse is the word for which we get the English transliteration ruminate, which means she's thinking on the things that he has to say to her. And notice she has a quill in her hand and she's writing. Notice what's under her left foot. And what maybe some of you can notice what this is or see what this is. What's under her left foot? Books. So she's written about history prior to this war, but there's a new chapter being added by someone who symbolically represents the Civil War. Okay, and he's sharing all the information, presumably, about the Battle of Gettysburg and before and after. And so she's adding another chapter. If you were to look at her from different angles, on one side of her chair is a relief that has a pyramid, and on the other side, broken columns and pilasters. It has to do with a similar arrangement that you saw at the Altar of Liberty. Those common designs and themes appear on the side of her chair. And then there's plenty and peace. Now, these are traditional names from antiquity, plenty and peace. But if we were to look at them through a modern lens, she more closely represents who? She's got a cornucopia in her hand, filled with fruits and vegetables. Mostly, for the most part, it's produce, but for the most part, it looks like wheat and grains of sorts. And so she represents agriculture. And he represents what? Notice the mechanic wheel? Industry, and he's a mechanic. And the two together then, what Randolph Rogers, the sculptor, is saying to us is that the two original visions for this country of agriculture, as proposed by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and Alexander's proposal of what the country should look like, industry and the life of the mechanic, that these two parallel, juxtaposed worlds can coexist under a national government. And so this national monument then pulls together four figures and tells us that they can live in harmony. I want you to notice on the side of her chair a violin. A violin is symbolic for harmony. And so the sculptor is telling us that these two can live side by side in harmony. There's much, much more I want to tell you about, but I want to keep it moving. Now, within the cemetery itself, the Civil War section of the cemetery, there's the William Saunders design of circle-shaped graves. And so there are 18 sections altogether. These are all northern states. There are some Confederates sprinkled throughout the midst, but not by design. And the states that sponsored the creation of the cemetery sent burial committees here. Their governors would send these committees to help with not only with the cleanup, but with the burials, and then to help William Saunders create a design that would transfer from paper, pencil and paper, to the actual battlefield. And so what Saunders decided to do was to bury the soldiers in a series of circles. And circles have a distinct meaning. Now, I go into this a lot more in depth when I'm out there in the field, but we'll keep it simple here because of what's on the plate still to come. Circles mean what? As we dig deeper and we think deeper. Eternity, right? There's no beginning and no end, alpha, omega. Unlike a square that has beginning and ending points, theoretically 4 points in a square, there's a stop and starting. With a circle, if it's done correctly, you can't see a beginning and an end. So it has to do with eternity, immortality, infinity. Oh, I see a hand back there. Go ahead.
Everyone's place is
Equal, equality. Very good. How many of you have heard of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table? All right? Whether you like it or not, when you invite someone over for dinner and everyone goes to sit down, It may never be spoken, but whoever chooses to sit at the head of the table is sending a nonverbal message. Squares, if you have a square table, a rectangle table, sitting at the head of the table sends squares and rectangles. Have you ever heard of organizational charts at work? Or men, NCAA basketball, bracketology, and women, of course, too. Squares denote hierarchy, an organizational chart. And one end of a table then can mean head of the table. Circles eliminate all of that, don't they? So we have equality, eternity, immortality, and we have unity. If you have a wedding ring on, unity. And so circles then are intentionally put there to represent all of the above. Now, there's a painting. You notice I like to mix in classicism with the Civil War era, so we're going to do that. Now, there's a famous painting by Raphael called The School of Athens. And it shows, the focal point of the painting is Aristotle and Plato walking out into a court together, into the Lyceum where they're about to teach. And so Plato is the elder, Aristotle is the student. As they're walking, they're talking, and Raphael wants you to notice that Plato is pointing up with one finger, and Aristotle is pointing out with 5 digits. And one, pointing up to one, means he's concerned with oneness and unity. Raphael's telling us that Aristotle, by holding out 5 digits, is interested in the many. He invented the sciences, by the way, the 7 sciences, which are the foundation of primary and secondary education. So humor me for a minute. Let's all hold up one finger, say unity. Unity. Now hold out 5 digits and say many. Many. Unity. Many. Okay, and so that's what we have here in the design. We have unity and we have many. Okay, e pluribus unum, out of many, one. Okay, and so think of that when you're out there. And if we want to dig deeper and we want to look deeper, if we want to take the blinders off, there's something else going on here too with Saunders. By the way, I'm married to an artist. You all have heard that a number of times. Artists love for you to interpret these things. I think, but you can go a little bit too far, admittedly. I remember Robert Frost wrote a poem once about some people going into the woods, an individual wandering into the woods. And so a class was held shortly after that poem came out. They were studying his poem. And someone wrote from the class, "Mr. Frost, are you talking about suicide there?" He said, "I don't know what you're talking about." It never had entered his mind to talk about suicide. A walk in the woods had nothing to do with suicide. But the idea is artists want you to think like this. And sometimes we hit the jackpot. And as you look at this circle symbolism, we see what looks very much like an amphitheater. A Greek amphitheater, or in Rome, a forum. And so there's this grand cloud of witnesses, if you will, around a central stage for eternity. Okay. Now, General Longstreet's equestrian, this is not going to be the focus of our program here, but there was a lot of bantering after the war to put an equestrian monument to General Longstreet on the battlefield. You all know that story very well. And there was a groundbreaking in July of 1941 to dedicate a monument. This is on the eve of World War II now, out on South Confederate Avenue on the southern end of the battlefield, just south of the Round Tops. Well, World War II came along and everyone's attention shifted to that. After the war, the idea for a Longstreet monument, that whole momentum had died, and it would not resume until the 1990s. And the monument that we have to General Longstreet now on West Confederate Avenue was put there in 1998 for the 135th anniversary, and it was done by Gary Castile. It was not the same movement that you see portrayed here. Well, when that movement died, the ground where Longstreet's monument was to be placed was still approved for a monument, but it would take 24 years before a monument was finally placed there. And it would be the Soldiers and Sailors Monument. And it was placed there in 1965. It was done by an artist named DeLue. And the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, I want you to notice as you look at it, that it's quite in contrast to the General Longstreet design monument. The General Longstreet monument was, first off, to a great man, not to a common soldier. Secondly, the difference in the monument that was placed there versus the one originally to be placed there is, whereas there was all kinds of discussions about Longstreet and a sunrise attack and whether he attacked early enough in the day and all of those post-war arguments, there's no ambiguity here about going forward or not going forward. Notice the soldier is running forward into battle. Now, if you look closely at the monument, it has 13 states on it, 3 middle states. This would be Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland. These would be border states, are included in that 13 number. So the Confederacy would claim 13 altogether. And around the base of it also, on the reverse side, is the name Walter Williams. And now there's been some debate in recent years whether his name belongs on the monument or not. But at the time in 1965, when DeLue had this monument dedicated, Walter Williams was perceived throughout the old Confederacy as the last surviving veteran to have lived and eventually died. And to understand the Soldiers and Sailors Monument to the Confederate soldier, you have to also blend that with the notion of Walter Williams' recent death. And so what the artist, DeLue, is telling us here is he's portraying Walter Williams as a single embodiment, a single representative of all the Confederate soldiers, common soldiers that fought during the war. And the last one having passed then becomes the impetus for creating this monument. Now, it's a little bit complex. I'm dealing with 2 themes. The Longstreet theme, the notion that Longstreet is controversial and is there hesitation? Was there a sunrise attack? Was there not? Having a soldier on the ground running forward eliminates that discussion altogether. In contrast, the Federals, this is neither good, bad, or in between, but I want you to see these things as we take the blinders off. On the Union side, the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, the VFW of the day, the Union Veterans Association, they chose to honor their last surviving veteran, Albert Wilson, sitting down. That's quite in contrast to the last Confederate veteran in a full gut sprint. So don't think that there wasn't a lot of discussion about how to portray Walter Williams, their last veteran. So there's a lot of movement going forward into battle, no hesitation. And there's a celebration of youth. There's also a celebration of the common soldier. I alluded to this already. Some of you know that in the 1960s, in academia, there began the new social history, which emphasized common soldiers, common people, everyday people, ordinary people, and moved away from the movers and shakers of the world. And so there was a celebration of the races, the ethnicities, the genders, everyday people versus heroes who were celebrated prior to the new social history. Prior to the new social history, academia refers to that history as Whig history. So in the 1950s back, it celebrates heroes, great men, you know, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Henry Fords, the Nicholas Tesla, these great individuals. The 1960s represents, at least in education, a huge, sharp shift away to the common man, the common soldier. You've heard the book Johnny Reb and Billy Yank. So they become really popular in the 1960s. And DeLue is emphasizing the common soldier. So as we look carefully then at this last Confederate soldier, or the embodiment of Confederate soldiers in one monument, we notice that there are some toes visible. This is an allusion to the Confederates sacrificed, and they endured and they persevered, not always with the best equipment. Duluth wants us to see the soldiers climbing a wall, where you need to look no farther than the Army of Northern Virginia's flank marker nearby to see a stone wall that they would have had to climb. Trossel Lane at the base of the hill is another stone wall they would have had to climb. So for those that have ears to ears and eyes to see, the sculptor Duluth is telling us that these soldiers not only were going forward, but they had to endure with not necessarily the best logistics, and they were climbing walls. Now, intermingled with that wall is a plant. The only plant that can survive on a rock, on the face of a rock, is ivy. And ivy that can climb up the side of a stone wall, for instance, can survive under the barest conditions. It can survive without any deep roots. It can survive living off the face of a rock. And so there's an implication there that the Confederate soldier, being honored after the last one just died, the last surviving Confederate veteran had just passed, there is a reflection upon the Confederate soldier having all these attributes and having an enduring friendship with each other. The vine intermingled with the stones talks about the tie that binded them for over a century. But soldiers and sailors monuments have a broader context to them. And that is, in the 1890s, from 1893 to 1900, that was the heyday of something known as the City Beautiful movement. I may say something about that once more before we're done. But the City Beautiful movement had to do with going into poor sections of a city, decrepit sections of a city, places where there were dark tenement houses, where there were robberies, where there was frequent crime, clearing those places out and putting in monuments dedicated to soldiers and sailors of the American Civil War. Now, why 1893 to 1900? I'll give you one reason now. One reason is the 1890s represents the height of the GAR's influence in Congress. As some of you remember, Vietnam veterans commanded a great deal of respect and attention in the 1970s and 1980s. They were at the height of their political influence. You'll recall in the 2004 election for president at the national level, there was debate about swift boats versus time in the Air Force Reserves. And then in the 2008 election, there was also some more talk about Vietnam. One of the candidates had been a POW in Vietnam. Notice the last election, there was no mention of Vietnam. That's because the Vietnam era has lost, the veterans are old enough now that their concerns are not represented to the same level. That's probably why there are some other concerns related to veterans right now, is because they've passed their peak, they've passed their prime in having political influence in Congress. Well, the height of the political influence of the GAR, the VFW of the day, if you will, for the Federals, their veterans organization was the 1890s. That's why all your Medal of Honors come out in the 1890s. That's why Gettysburg National Military Park and several other, Antietam, Shiloh, come into existence in the 1890s. And City Beautiful movements often featured as a centerpiece after they cleared out whatever they wanted to clear out and then they wanted to design around it, featured a Civil War monument to soldiers and sailors, and it usually had 4 faces to it: infantry, artillery, cavalry, and signalmen, depending on the 4 sides. And there might be some variation on that. And the radio doesn't really take off until the 1920s. So in the 1890s, Nickelodeons start to come into existence in the 1890s, early movie houses in the 1890s and 1900s. But people did not rely on visual technology and audio technology in the 1890s. Communities stayed put for the most part, and a visual reinforcement of a monument instilled in the public, who had to pass its fountains every day and look up at its beautiful sculpture, it instilled in them civic pride. It gave them an example to live by. And those things over time would make better citizens of people. This was the example. This was the visual aid of how you were supposed to conduct yourself as citizens. And it was supposed to clean up the cities and make people, if the environment is called, the overall movement is called positive environmentalism. If you clean up the environment, you have playgrounds and schools and bright, airy buildings, then folks in industrial settings will act and live and behave better and aspire to higher ideals. So soldiers and sailors monuments have their birth in cities in the 1890s. And the GAR had a lot to do with that. Also, there are soldiers and sailors monuments in New York and Detroit. There's one in Allentown, Pennsylvania. There's a number of them out there. You just keep your eyes and ears open for them. And this is a close-up of the one in Indiana. I got a chance to speak at the Civil War Roundtable in Indianapolis a few years ago, and they took me downtown to look at this, and this was really special. But you can see up close, we can see some version of Lady Liberty, and we can also see a slave who's taking off his shackles. We can see soldiers going into battle. We can see artisans having conversations about their lives. And so this would be something that people who lived in a city could walk past every day, and they could hear the water flowing and see the fountains, and it would remind them, this is what we look up to, this is what we want our kids to aspire to. City Beautiful, 1893 to 1900. So the Soldiers and Sailors at Gettysburg Monument is a tie-in to all the above. Are the blinders coming off? Okay. Some of you already knew these things, but if there's someone that didn't, then, okay, the Eternal Peace Light Memorial. As we look at the Eternal Peace Light Memorial on the first day's battlefield, we know it was dedicated in 1938, the 75th anniversary, the last great reunion of the veterans. 250,000 people attended. And as we think about FDR being present and speaking, and other speeches being given, and the Boy Scouts pushing the veterans around, and tens of thousands of people. What I want you to also imagine is then, of course, a huge U.S. flag over the shaft of the monument until the momentous unveiling of the monument, and the oohing, the eyeing, and the cheering, and the clapping, and the crowds when it was finally unveiled. As you take a closer look at the monument, you've probably heard these things, but it's worth repeating, that the base is made of granite from the state of Maine and the shaft of dolomite limestone from Alabama for obvious reasons, right? There's a unity that's taking place at this last great reunion. Right. Okay, but now let's go deeper. Let's take the blinders off even further. And that is, what did Philippe Crête design the peace light to look like? What was his inspiration? And you need to look no further than antiquity and go back to one of the original 7 wonders of the world as put forward by Plato in his writings in antiquity. And that would be, one of those 7 was the lighthouse at Alexandria, Egypt. And it was a beacon at night. There's been theories on how the light was projected, but there was likely a huge fire, and there were mirrors used, probably copper mirrors of sorts, and it would cast the light out to sea to keep ships from crashing ashore. Okay, those are the obvious things. So the peace light, look, I could have put up several slides, but if you go back and look at artist depictions of what the lighthouse of Alexandria looked like, over and over and over again, it's a match with the Peace Light Memorial. And so what is Philippe Crête telling us with the Peace Light? Yes, he's talking about light, he's talking about unity, he's talking about friendship and fellowship between North and South. Those are the common things that you would hear and read about. But he's also telling us something deeper. He's telling us that lighthouse is not only unity and light to show the way in the future towards harmony between North and South, but he's also telling us that as long as we remember what happened here and remember the 4 years of the Civil War, a light like this helps us remember that so that our nation doesn't have a shipwreck again. Really, this battlefield exists in large part. There's a lot of reasons why. But one of the underlying reasons why we have a battlefield that's part of the National Park Service is an open invitation for people to come and to remember collectively their past, to discuss, to debate, to civilly argue, so that we prevent this from happening again. This is a reminder, a shipwreck occurs when we do thus and so, right? And so that's what we have here. As we look closer, you can see two ladies. Can you see them there? Okay, now let's move in closer to them. These two ladies, if you study them, these two ladies are actually two Egyptian ladies, and they're referred to in antiquity, in ancient Egypt, as the two ladies. They're just called the two ladies. And so Philippe Crête is showing us the two ladies. Now, who were the two ladies? The two ladies were representative in ancient Egypt of the Upper Nile, Upper Egypt. Upper Nile, which is Lower Egypt, and Lower Nile, which is Upper Egypt. Let's just stick with North and South. In deity form, they were never combined together. They were never mixed together. They were actually kept separate, meaning that Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt remained separate, but they worked in harmony. And so Philippe Crête is making a correlation between ancient Egypt and North and South, living together in harmony. Now notice that one of them is carrying the laurel wreath. Laurel, don't rest on your laurels. Presumably that would then be the northern half of the equation, the northern half of the two ladies. That would be the north. But notice that the southerner has her back with a shield. And then at the bottom of the screen, we can see a falcon. And anytime we see a falcon in ancient Egypt, it means Horus. Horus was portrayed as a falcon, symbolically in mummification and burial ceremonies and public ceremonies. He would wear a falcon's head, and then the headdress for his casket, if you will, was actually a bird's head. Horus was a falcon. The falcon then is symbolic of the Pharaoh in the flesh ruling over Egypt. And so we have here a ruler holding up, actually holding up the light that's being projected there. So we don't have any ordinary falcon there. We have Horus, the Pharaoh, showing the way. Oh, a falcon in ancient Egypt through Horus also means light, it means spirit, and it means freedom. The Pennsylvania Memorial. Now, the basics of the Pennsylvania Memorial is that at least some form of it was dedicated in 1910. Its sculptor was Cottrell, and we know that it has over 34,000 Pennsylvania names on the monument. Right? And those are some of the basic facts. It's crowned by Nike, the Angel of Victory. It's the biggest monument on the battlefield. Those are quick, quippish statements that we give to new visitors on the battlefield on a regular basis. But now, that's not what this program is about. This program is about going deeper, right? It's about taking the blinders off. Okay. And so as we look closer at the Pennsylvania Memorial, it looks strikingly like the Arch of Titus. Arch of Titus in ancient Rome, circa 82 AD, is the inspiration for a lot of archways throughout Europe. In Russia and in Spain and various other places, the Arc de Triomphe itself is modeled on the Arch of Titus. It's one of the most famous, if not the most famous arch in the world. And the Pennsylvania Memorial, then, as you look at it carefully, and we'll look at it up close, mirrors it in a number of ways. Now you have Lincoln and Governor Curtin, and you have other famous Pennsylvanians around the monument. But if you look at the Arch of Titus, there's a space here where a statue probably sat before it was defaced. And those kind of things happened during the Middle Ages. If you look at it also close, you'll notice an archway that has a keystone. When I worked at Independence Hall in the 1980s in Philadelphia, where the Declaration of Independence was signed, one of the points we made frequently was Pennsylvania, among the original 13 colonies in 13 states, was called the Keystone State because it was centrally located. And some of the early national congresses met there, as did George Washington, the president, lived there in Philadelphia because it was centrally located before Washington, D.C. was created. So Pennsylvania historically is known as the Keystone State. And so you have that deeper meaning going on here. The archway, let's veer for just a moment and look at the Arch of Constantine. The Arch of Constantine allows us to make some of the same points. It's a little bit more elaborate. It has 3 portals, but if you were to look at it really close, there are detailed friezes and detailed markings on the cornice. As there are famous Pennsylvanians on the cornice all the way around the Pennsylvania Memorial, so did the Arch of Constantine have these friezes. And in addition to that, they had statues all around it. The Pennsylvania Memorial, of course, has metal statues. Now let's go a little bit deeper and a little bit closer. Let's go back to the Arch of Titus and the Pennsylvania Memorial. And so as we compare them up close, what I want you to see is I want you to grasp the basic concept of what a Roman arch meant. Now, to the Romans, the arch was sacred. You know, if you were to go to Israel today or you were to go to Greece today and you were to chop down a fig tree or an olive tree, in some provinces, you'll be put to death. The olive tree is revered in places like Greece and parts of the Holy Land, and you can receive capital punishment if you chop down an olive tree, and in some cases a fig tree. Well, to the Romans, the thing that they loved and was at the very heart and center of their identity was the arches. You all know about that, don't you? The arches that held up the aqueducts, that brought in water, that allowed them to have cities in unusual places. The arches that were used to create the Colosseum, arches that were used to create bridges across water, aqueducts, if you will. Arches, how many of you have seen a Volkswagen Bug? You know, it's an arch. Or if you were to go to a fast food restaurant today and ask for a diet drink, they'll take the arch on the top and pop it down, right? And when you invert anything, it's stronger. That's the whole notion of trusses. When you build a house, there's a series of trusses that point up because it's hard to take the point of a truss and push it down. The point of the truss then is a point of great strength. And the arch is based on that concept. So the Romans then, when they wanted to celebrate great emperors and great victories, they would every so often have a public works project and build an arch. And so there are arches that archaeologists have uncovered all throughout ancient Rome that have to do with great victories in battles or great leaders, great emperors. Now, the symbolic way of celebrating an arch would be after a great victory, the Roman general who was responsible would bring his legions into the city. There would be a parade. The Caesars would make sure that somehow in the midst of the parade, the crowd received bread, oil, olive oil, wine, sort of a social welfare program that made everyone feel really good. And then the celebration over their army being the finest on the earth because they had just won a great battle. The prisoners were brought through the streets in cages, pulled by donkeys and horses. And the crowds would throw vegetables and various other things at them. They were stingy and smelly, and they were angry. The Apostle Paul mentions in one of the epistles that he was imprisoned outside of one of these archways, and he could hear these victory celebrations every so often. And he talks about how there were incenses in the air that was to, like a sage, it was supposed to affect the crowd and heighten their impression of the greatness of the Roman army and everything festival about the occasion. But he said to the prisoners locked in the cage, those beautiful smells, those wonderful aromas, to them were horrible and putrid because they translated into their brain as death. They were moments from being publicly executed. Those same smells, though, breathed in by the victors, had a wonderful smell. So there's two impressions then on the same thing. And these archways then, if you're to fully understand them, they represent a victory of celebration. That's why the Angel of Victory Nike is on top. This is a series, is the Pennsylvania Memorial, a series of 4 arches where victory is celebrated. I suppose if a Confederate walked through there in the early 1900s, the smell would not be as great, figuratively speaking. That's the point. Okay, and this is a celebration of Pennsylvania as well as a celebration of victory. So if you need a victory in your life, walk through there today. And then if you look even closer, let's say at the Arch of Constantine with the Pennsylvania Memorial, you can see ladies of virtue here representing everything that's good and decent and justice. Okay, and so now, I stuck this in. I debated whether to do that or not. But when I was doing a program on East Cemetery Hill a few years ago from a Confederate perspective, everywhere that I walked from the North Carolina or Louisiana perspective, I could see that archway. I would catch lines of sight suddenly to it. It would kind of take my breath away. It's my favorite structure on the battlefield. And then I was reading in Bill Frazzanito's excellent book on early photography. He makes the point that the most photographed structure on the battlefield by the photographers that came here, Tipton and Gutkunst and Gardner and O'Sullivan, the photographs that they took of the buildings on this battlefield were disproportionately of this structure. They were carried away with taking a picture of the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse, dedicated in 1855 as the grand entrance to the town cemetery. The 2 most famous sketches of the battle, arguably, are Alfred Ward and Edward Forbes' sketch of the Confederates charging up East Cemetery Hill, and the focal point of both sketches show that archway. Have you all seen those? Okay, of the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse. So why is it the most photographed and the most famous sketched structure on the battlefield? And I could give you several reasons, but one of them will be, that's the one I want to focus, is that it has an uncanny resemblance to the Arc de Triomphe, to the Arch of Constantine, to the arches that exist all throughout Europe. It's almost like a natural victory arch. A spiritual victory arch. You know, if you were, let's say, at the German Reformed Church or the Presbyterian Church and you were buried there locally, entering through that archway symbolically meant that you were moving towards some spiritual victory. You were ascending from this earth, and so it was a positive thing. That's the message here. But you'll notice that there are laurel wreaths to victory. There's an archway, and anytime you enter through an archway in antiquity, it has to do with victory. Isn't that interesting? The key position on the battlefield has an archway in existence before the battle. Ooh, that's kind of spooky. Okay. Okay, let's return to this briefly. The Great White City idea. What really started the Great White City, yes, it had to do with the GAR being at the height of their powers and commissioning and helping to propose soldiers and sailors monuments in inner cities. But what really kick-started the whole City Beautiful movement was the Great White City in 1893 in Chicago, when they hosted the World's Fair there in Chicago. And people came from all over the world. Now, there was a great fire in Chicago in 1871. So the Great White City, in a way, was stating to the world, in a self-conscious way, Chicago was saying, we're like the phoenix, we've risen out of the ashes, we've been reborn. And Nicholas Tesla experimented with AC/DC alternating current electricity, so the city lit up at a time when cities just were not lit up. There was some city lighting occurring in the 1870s in various places, but no one had seen anything like this. And it was bright and it was white. And as you look carefully, you'll notice domes like the one on the Pennsylvania Memorial. You'll see the mansard roof that was so common in France. I must mention this briefly. What inspired the Great White City and ultimately inspired City Beautiful movements was Haussmann's design of inner city Paris. He was commissioned very much indirectly through Napoleon III. And it was the idea of clearing out the bad sections of the city, removing the narrow streets where people would barricade and fight against the authorities, create open boulevards, raise civic pride by putting beautiful white statuary, uplifting monuments. There were fountains, circular fountains, and libraries, public buildings of all kinds, opera houses, art museums. And that whole notion really started in the 1890s here in this country, but it was borrowed from Haussmann's work in the 1860s and 70s over in Paris. Over in Paris, they called it the Beaux Arts movement. But here it was called the City Beautiful movement. But you have the whole circular design that you see in the National Cemetery, which started before the French Revolution. It goes back to Louis XIV's designs at Versailles. So what we see here then, and the idea is that this stood in strong contrast, not only to the fire that had destroyed, that everyone had read about. When they visited the city, they could see this, that the city had fully come back. But it also represented, in contrast to the dingy, dirty, dark tenement houses and where a lot of the masses lived in the streets, and where things were unclean, bright white celebrated the exact opposite of that. That's very important to understand in relation to City Beautiful. The monuments that you see here at Vicksburg, Chickamauga, that are big and huge and have domes, guess where that idea is born? City Beautiful. City Beautiful then took its cues from Beaux Arts in France. And so that's a lot of the monuments were placed on the battlefield in the 1880s and 1890s and the early 1900s, and they're coming from the City Beautiful movement. So everything's connected as we dig deeper. And then I wanted you to notice the context of the design. You have the Pennsylvania Memorial and then the first Minnesota Monument. Artists and architects always create a milieu, a context for their design. And you can see, as you look in the lower right-hand corner, the Pantheon. And the Pantheon is still the largest standing dome building that doesn't have a steel support structure system to it. But in the Pantheon, which is in Rome, in front of it, it has an obelisk that was designed at the time of Ramesses II. Ramesses II was at about the time of the Great Escape of the Israelites to the Promised Land and the whole Exodus story. So how does it relate here? I want you to see first off the context and antiquity of a dome building with Doric columns, Corinthian and Ionic curls and acanthuses. And then I want you to see in front of it an obelisk. And I want you to see that our battlefield has those same kind of pairings. Here's Hexamer's New Jersey battery. Can you see the parallels? Can you see the parallels? I should say this too. This is a real eye-opener if you haven't heard this one before. Rome, when they conquered the whole world, they brought those treasures to the city of Rome to show off in the Colosseum. They would bring exotic animals in from all over the world to say, we're Rome, we control the world. We can bring in an elephant here, we can bring in a lion, we can do anything. And they transported in obelisk from the Nile in Egypt. And the obelisk were markers, like you have highway markers that tell you how close you're going to Harrisburg or in the other direction to Hagerstown if you're on 81. They were markers, so when you're traveling by way of the Nile, you knew what town you were coming upon, what province you were coming upon. But the obelisk also were ancient sundials. If you ever stuck a stick in the sand, let's say at the beach, and it casts a shadow on one side or the other, and that in a crude way tells you what time of the day it is. It serves as a sundial. How many of you knew that? All right, and so that's what the City Beautiful took over Washington, D.C. in that way, and one of the centerpieces is the Washington Monument. It's an obelisk. But this obelisk then, some historians believe the obelisk is the inspiration for the church steeple. And so all throughout this town you see church steeples. It goes all the way back to taking the obelisk out of Egypt and placing it there in Rome. And so there we have that kind of relationship, and I want you to see that relationship exists all over this battlefield in the design. There's a lot of obelisks on the battlefield. They don't all necessarily have a sharp point like this one. But the 1st Minnesota, really most of the monuments out there are obelisks. If you really want to make a comparison, fit closely, take a look at the Illinois Memorial at Vicksburg compared to the Pantheon. It's amazing, isn't it? Okay, City Beautiful, 1890s, early 1900s. And then if you were to look up inside the Pennsylvania Memorial, you'll see the oculus. And the oculus today is just a steel reinforcement inside the dome. But the original that it was based on would have been the one in the Pantheon. And what the Romans did was they carved into the stone. Engineers learned that they carved in the stone, it lessened the what? Weight, so that a dome structure, and also built up like an archway, it could stand, and it's been standing for close to 2,000 years. But the Pennsylvania Memorial is inspired by that. And there are more comparisons too. We're down to 2 more. We have the Virginia Monument. Now, the Virginia Monument, when you look at it, you can see several things, but I want to focus primarily on 2. Let me just say, in a broader sense, when you look at it, you can see a monument, an equestrian monument to General Lee. Okay, you can see at the base an artillery, infantry, an auxiliary, and an eclectic mix, kind of a conglomerate of a representative of Virginia. You can see the Virginia flag. Now this is kind of an interesting story. In 1913, at the 50th reunion, the cornerstone was placed here, a small base was placed here. The monument wasn't actually dedicated with the throng of crowds until 1917. And there's several reasons for the delay, but one of the reasons for the delay was there was some hesitation with the GAR with allowing a Confederate flag in the design of the monument. And so instead, what was substituted by the time of the dedication was a Virginia flag. So if you look at it really close, it's the Virginia flag. Now, that would have made it less controversial if you study the 1938 Great Reunion, 75th at the Peace Light Memorial. There were speeches given by Southerners there, and they were angry-driven speeches about how they felt they were being denied showing the Confederate flag at different times over the last 30 years. And so the Virginia Monument is a standing example of the debate over the GAR wanting to allow the Confederate flag. Kathy Harrison, the former senior historian who was here for 38 years, and her research, at least last I spoke with her about this, she could not find one example of a Virginia flag in the ranks in Pickett's charge. But if you were to look at the monument, you get the impression that the Virginia flag was there. Okay, and then we have an equestrian to Lee. But now let's go a little deeper. It looks an awful lot like the equestrian to Lee, dedicated in 1890 on Monument Avenue in Richmond, Virginia. They look very similar, don't they? Not exactly, but similar. Okay, and some folks, when they look at the Virginia Monument, see in it an inspiration of the Lee Monument in Richmond, Virginia on Monument Avenue. And Monument Avenue was designed, it was kind of a southern version of City Beautiful. And we have a monument to Jeb Stuart, to Robert E. Lee. There's one to Stonewall Jackson. There's a modern statue along it today to Arthur Ashe, the African-American tennis player. But along this Richmond version of City Beautiful, if you will, these four trees, columns of trees, perhaps representing four columns of Confederate soldiers marching, and then these Confederate equestrian statues that you see there. And so what that was designed to do then was to create not only a City Beautiful idea, where high-rises would go up, apartment buildings would go up, churches would come to complement or be improved to complement, and you would create this civic pride area. But some folks look at it a little bit different, and that is when they look at the Lee Memorial. Thomas Connolly looked at it this way, and Marble Man, Alan Nolan and Lee looked at it this way, and that is they looked at the Lee Memorial in Richmond as a revival of the deification, a revival of the lost cause, if you will, a propelling of the lost cause, a validation of the lost cause, and a deification of Lee when it was dedicated in 1890. The lost cause was a post-war explanation that grew up in the South over a period of 25 years after the war through many articles and books that were written. There were a lot of contributors. But the canon that was collectively put together by the 1890s that we call Lost Cause talked about why the South lost, what it was really fighting for, dismissed the notion that slavery was the central cause of the war, and several other things along those lines, blamed certain people for losses at certain battle, like General Longstreet. And part of Lost Cause also deified Robert E. Lee. And we see this today, and I'm not going to be real specific, we see this in athletics. Someone wins a second or a third trophy, and then they take on some other intimidating persona. Okay? And so Lee was deified as all that was good in the Lost Cause explanation of what the war was fought about. He was the perfect gentleman, and this, that, and the other. Well, to some folks that have criticized Lee over the years, I mentioned Connolly and Nolan and others, what they would say is that it spawned Southerners kind of digging their heels in and saying we were right, and then the Lee Memorial, the Lee Monument, became a place for them to rally and to have parades and demonstrations and to talk about why the South was right. And so there's kind of that, some folks would see a dark side in the Virginia Memorial because they link it in their memory to what they know happened in 1890. Now, maybe this is unfair to put this on Lee's shoulders. Lee was not around for this to happen, but in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson was passed by the Supreme Court, which said separate but equal. You know, the notion of separate drinking fountains and separate restrooms, and so a dark curtain, if you will, of opportunity, blocking opportunities, the end of civil rights, once and for all ended in 1896 until it was revived in the 1960s. And that seemed to coincide with Monument Avenue coming into existence. So some people saw kind of a darker, uglier side to this monument. And perhaps that's unfair to Lee, but when you're doing history, you have to present all these things. Some people look at the Lee Memorial and link it with the one here and link it with the one in Richmond and see they don't see anything but positive. All up and down Monument Avenue today, there are 10K runs. There are Easter parades. I couldn't resist putting this wonderful creature in the corner. I knew that would warm somebody's heart. But that's from an Easter parade, and there have been Easter parades up and down Monument Avenue. They have a huge marathon there every year. Troops have marched past it. So in many cases, then, the Virginia Monument at Gettysburg, if we link it to the one in Richmond, to the Lee Monument at Richmond, there's a consistency of pleasant memories. And as I ask you what you would see as you drive back past the Virginia Memorial, I'll tell you this quick story. How many of you have heard of Colonel Sheeds? And he taught in the high school system here in Gettysburg in the 1950s, 60s, and he was a celebrated historian here, had his hand in a lot of different things, and he was a legendary licensed guide. And when I moved here, I got in on the tail end of that legend and got to meet him and so on. He was the one that took John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy around the battlefield. And, okay, this is the same person. So if you ever see a photograph of the Kennedys here at Gettysburg, with them is Colonel Sheeds. But of the many stories that Sheeds told that still lingers, one of them is he was taking, as a licensed guide, a family around the battlefield. And when they made it to the Virginia Monument, they stepped out, and he made a comment along the lines of Lee and being a traitor to his country. I don't know that he meant it to come out quite like that, but he didn't mind telling the story time and again. Turns out these were Virginians that were in the car, and they told him he could walk back to the visitor center. And he always got a good laugh out of that too. He learned to laugh at himself. And when you are out there, what do you see? Do you see a romantic hero, a romantic depiction, a neoclassical depiction of a hero, or do you see something else? North Carolina, farthest to the front. Now, when you've all heard of the Gutzon Borglum statue to North Carolina, right? Stop for on the auto tour. And he's famous for sculpting Mount Rushmore, okay, among other things. And this was dedicated in the 1920s, and it was made quite an impression. But as we look at it, yes, there are several characteristics and attributes about it that Borglum would want us to take away, about an officer pointing the way, and of soldiers following him, and of someone holding up the standard, and those kind of things. But if we dig deeper, and that's what we've been doing the whole program, we've been taking off the blinders. There's a lot of, as with the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, there is a lot of what? Forward motion. Now, if you have eyes to see and ears to hear, that's a statement that the North Carolinians didn't turn and hightail it. They went forward, right? And some of you know that after the battle, two newspapers, a Williamsport, Maryland newspaper and a Richmond newspaper, thanks to the telegraph and couriers and so forth, and express riders, within a few days after the battle, these two newspapers, and then subsequently many others, proliferated the story that the reason the final charge failed was because the Virginians under General Pickett were let down by the North Carolinians under General Pettigrew. And I've lived in North Carolina and Virginia, and the rivalries played out in collegiate contests. But you have to know your audience when you're speaking in front of a crowd. And if you have North Carolinians and Virginians, we don't know this for sure, so I have to add this emphasis. But some people believe that because General Pickett's report was ordered to be destroyed. Lee read it, and it was the only reason you would have to destroy a report and someone tell you through the chain of command to destroy an after-action report is that it was too personal. Okay, and he probably implicated people for failing his Virginians, and probably implicated Edward Porter Alexander's artillery for running out of ammunition or missing the mark. He probably blamed the North Carolinians on his left, and there was enough blame that General Lee asked him to write another report and just give the facts. Okay, who deserves the Roll of Honor medal? How many rounds were fired? How many casualties? What do the units look like now? Make it non-personal. And General Pickett's report may or may not have been torn up. There are rumors. LaSalle Corbett claimed once. His fiancee claimed once that it was still out there. But in any case, he never wrote a second report that we know of. So that's why when you go through the official after-action reports that were published in the 1880s, there isn't a report from General Pickett. So and that's why there's a lot of confusion as what Pickett's charge was doing as the person that was in charge of it. Report doesn't seem to exist. But we believe Pickett. Remember, Lee found him after the charge, and he was choking down tears and his eyes were welling up, and he was with the wounded Confederates along Stevens Run behind the Spangler Farm, Seminary Ridge area. And Lee found him and said, "Reform your division." He said, "General Lee, I don't have a division." Remember that conversation? Okay. Some believe, based on everything that I've told you, all the circumstantial evidence, that Pickett talked to two war correspondents. We would call them embedded reporters today, and unloaded on the North Carolinians. And that the two newspapers that soon, a few days after, reported on the North Carolinians quitting, not going all the way across the charge, across the fields, is spillage from General Pickett. Well, the problem became so bad within the Confederate Army of the blame game that General Lee emphasized again it was all his fault, because ultimately he's responsible. But it was to start to stop the squabbling. And he talked to the Confederate Secretary of War, Seddon, corresponded with the Confederate Secretary of War, Seddon, and asked that all war correspondents be removed from the Army because they were stirring the pot. As a result, the North Carolinians were not able to address these accusations until 20 years after the war. So in the meantime, the term Pickett's charge cemented, crystallized in the American imagination with a reunion in 1887 at the Angle, where Virginians were celebrated along with Philadelphians. The North Carolinians could never undo the damage. That's why North Carolinians then, and perhaps some today, cringe when you don't say the Pickett-Pettigrew charge, or you don't say the Longstreet assault, which is what it was supposed to be called, but the Virginians eventually captured the story. And so by the 1880s, there were North Carolinians that were upset, and there was a captain named Young in the 26th North Carolina that wrote an article published throughout the South. Since it's been republished in a book by Jordan. Jordan is a regimental historian for North Carolina, and we have those in our the Jordan series in our library downstairs. But if you read the article by Young, Young says that the North Carolinians not only didn't stop or quit on the Virginians, but they went further than the Virginians. And for validation, he goes one step further, and he said that the furthest North Carolinians was 30 paces beyond the furthest Virginian. So he adds emphasis to that. So in 1988, at the 125th anniversary, the movement had been afoot for some time. There was a monument placed to North Carolina, 26th North Carolina, on Meredith Avenue, First Days Battlefield, which helped build momentum towards this one 3 years later. And if you stand at the furthest Virginia monument inside the Union lines, that would be the Armistead Killed Monument, Wounded Monument, and you count off 30 paces, it takes you to the North Carolina Monument. And then if you were to look peripherally, you'll also notice that Trent Lott one bettered everyone with the 11th Mississippi Monument being placed a little bit further than the North Carolina Monument. So North Carolina, they had their say 125 years later. So Pickett is talking perhaps to reporters behind the scenes, but then the rebuttal comes 125 years later. But North Carolinians are not to be messed with. They're not to be called cowards, and they're not to be challenged in this way. Monuments started to pop up all over. I had so many that I couldn't put them in the slideshow, so I tried to create a collage of monuments that started to go up in the 1880s, 1890s, where they state they were the first at Bethel. That was a battle near Hampton, Virginia. Okay, and that was a fight in the vicinity of Fortress Monroe. All right, the Battle of First Bethel. They were first at Big Bethel. They were the farthest to the front at Gettysburg and Chickamauga. And they were the last to fire a volley at Appomattox. and this marker is where that last volley was reportedly fired at Appomattox. But if you look at these other markers, they talk about North Carolinians were the farthest to the front at Gettysburg. And that's repeated over and over again. And there are many more than I've placed here. Oh, and notice the quote that I've placed at the top. The Latin term esse quam videri, translated means to be rather than to seem to be. So North Carolinians are going even further, and they're saying on their stat, and they made it their North Carolina motto, their official motto in 1893. They're saying not only were we first at all these places, but we're the real deal. Okay, and this is at Oakwood Cemetery near Raleigh, North Carolina, where there are a number of Gettysburg dead that were transferred from this battlefield. Same emphasis, first at Bethel, farthest to the front at Gettysburg and Chickamauga, and last at Appomattox. I would also emphasize that I was thinking about this. You have some strange stream of conscience when you're working on programs like this. Notice when Orville and Wilbur Wright broke their barrier, it was called First in Flight. North Carolinians are into first at this and first at that. So they set the record straight then. And this visual kind of helps reinforce what we talked about. Here's the North Carolina monument, 26th North Carolina monument. And then we can see just the tip of the Armistead fallen marker. So Gettysburg monuments, what do you see? When you look at the monuments at the high water mark, do you see a final verdict on the rebellion? Or instead, do you see an altar to liberty? Do you see, when you go to the National Monument, and the Soldiers' National Monument in the cemetery, do you see a national conversation around the base of that monument? When you look at the graves that surround it in a circle, do you see e pluribus unum, out of many, one? Do you see a grand theater there, a forum, an amphitheater, waiting for the final day when... do you see an eternal light to warn against national shipwrecks at the Peace Light? For the Soldiers' Monument, do you see City Beautiful? Do you see neoclassicism? Do you see Beaux Arts? Do you see the Great White City? Do you see Romanticism, which is more of a traditional classic presentation of statues on the battlefield? With the Robert E. Lee Equestrium, do you see the lost cause? Or do you see a romantic hero, a great hero here at Gettysburg? And can you see North Carolina's eternal grudge carved in stone? Thank you all for coming out today and remembering